Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to C tier for patch 11.13. We'll be breaking down each tier of synergies and delving into what makes those traits useful in the current meta. There is a B patch, but it won't affect the majority of the traits in the meta. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier, which consists of Dawnbringer, Forgotten, Redeemed, Mystic, Ironclad, and Eternal. The meta is all about vertical traits, with Dawnbringer, Forgotten, and Redeemed being at the forefront of the meta. The other traits are situational, but valuable to use. Starting off, we have Dawnbringer. Dawnbringer is a synergy full of useful champions throughout the game, while the trait itself provides valuable utility in the form of healing and a minor damage boost. Early game, you have Gragas and Kha'Zix. Stage 3, you can rely on Nidalee or Riven to carry, and Stage 4 onward, the duo of Karma and Garen can win 2v9. Unlike other vertical traits, Dawnbringer has breakpoints at 2 and 4 instead of 3 and 6. This may not seem like a big deal, but it does help the synergy be more flexible, as it's far easier to get 4 Dawnbringer online than it is 6 Forgotten or Redeemed. All in all, Dawnbringer is likely the strongest synergy after the nerfs that Redeemed received in the B patch. Next up is Forgotten. Forgotten isn't quite as strong as it was in the last meta, but overall is still one of the best 6-piece synergies. The reason, much like Dawnbringer, is having a lot of useful champions throughout the game. With 9 total Forgotten champions in the pool, you can almost always piece together a Forgotten composition throughout the game, and hitting 6 is doable in Stage 3. The main issue with Forgotten is finding purchase in the late game, as Draven 2 is a necessity and Rise needs to have mana items. Plus, you do need to have prioritized making shadow items, which isn't a huge issue but can be a problem if you're not hitting the shadow item cap to maximize the stat boost. Issues aside, Forgotten can easily earn you a top 4, as they have one of the strongest mid-game power spikes. Redeemed would have been at the very top of the S tier, but the B patch nerfs to Lux have lowered its value. We may even see the trait drop down further in priority, but even with Lux being nerfed, there's still Vel'Koz as the main carry, as well as the builds using Varus and Pantheon. Of course, Rel plus Leona is still going to be a solid frontline, so even without an overpowered Lux, the trait should still be doing just fine. And up next, we have the 2 splash traits, Mystic and Ironclad. Mystic is almost a must-have in every composition in the current meta, considering how magic damage heavy the compositions are mostly. That said, swapping between Mystic or Ironclad is a common tactic in the late game, as they are perfect traits to add in on top of a meta 6-piece vertical trait. So be willing to splash in these 2 traits depending on what the rest of the lobby you're up against is playing. And lastly, for the S tier, we have Eternal. This is the spot for Kindred, who brings a lot of late game value to any boards thanks to their ability, as well as being a Mystic. All in all, if you're looking for a champion to add into your board at level 8 or 9, chances are Kindred is one of the best options. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Nightbringer, Revenant, Invoker, Cavalier, Brawler, Dragonslayer, Skirmisher, and Caretaker. These synergies are all around above average in the current meta, whether on their own or to boost the value of the S tier vertical traits. First up is Nightbringer. Nightbringer, specifically Yasuo, is still going strong in the meta. Yasuo isn't nearly as strong as he was in the last meta, but true damage is true damage, especially against traits like Redeemed that stack a lot of armor and magic resist. Yasuo 3 can still win games, though it's more common to transition away from Yasuo into a different carry. Nightbringer helps facilitate Yasuo as a carry throughout the early and mid game. Up next is Revenant, and by Revenant we mean Ivern and Volibear, the frontline duo of the late game. Most compositions want these 2 in the late game if possible, with Dawnbringer using them frequently at level 8. They provide good CC and useful traits like Invoker, making them the ideal frontline champions that stall out fights thanks to Revenant. Speaking of, next up is Invoker. Invoker mainly ties into Karma with Dawnbringer, but it also has use for Redeemed thanks to Syndra. Outside of that, late game Invoker boards are still one of the best capped compositions that you can run. The main issue is getting to that point. But at the end of the day, the main reason Invoker is so highly valued is due to Karma. Moving on, we have Cavaliers as one of the better frontline options in the meta. Cavalier is particularly useful in Forgotten compositions, as that synergy tends to lack frontline. Rel is by far the best frontline champion in the game for any composition and opens up doors for Ironclad as well. And of course, Rel is also part of Redeemed. Cavalier isn't a trait that you will always have, but it's always worth considering if you need additional frontline. Another frontline trait to consider is Brawler. The Brawler is more of an early to mid-game frontline synergy, as Warwick, Gragas, and Nunu are all valuable assets in the current meta. Basically, if you're unsure what to use early game for your frontline, toss in some Brawlers. Next, we have Dragonslayer. Dragonslayer is usually attached with Nightbringer, as 4 Dragonslayer, 4 Nightbringer is the best way to utilize Yasuo. But with Skirmishers being back in the meta, and Mordekaiser pairing well with Forgotten, the trait has a lot of value outside of just being used for Yasuo. All around a useful synergy depending on what build you're using. Since we mentioned them, let's talk about Skirmishers. They're back again in the meta after receiving several buffs in patch 11.13. Nidalee can easily carry stage 3 and 4, and while Jax will struggle late game, he's still capable of getting you a consistent top 4. And the last trait in the A tier is Caretaker. Heimerdinger is a late game champion that can be difficult to use well. This is because he mainly needs items, particularly a mana item and a solid frontline, to buy him time. But much like late game Invokers, Heimerdinger is one of the best champions to add to a capped level 9 board. Let's move on now to the B tier. This tier consists of Cruel, Hellion, Ranger, Abomination, Legionnaire, Assassin, Draconic, and Knight. These synergies are all solid options in the meta, but are more situational than the previous tiers. At the top of B tier, we have Cruel. Teemo, like Heimerdinger, can win you in the late game. But it's difficult to consistently play Teemo because you need to be already winning to utilize him effectively. Without a good economy and a lot of health to work with, Teemo is at best a trait bot or just unplayable entirely. Costing health, while unique, makes Teemo a niche champion even though he is quite strong. As for the other Hellions, well, they did receive buffs in 11.13 and the B patch. We're speculating at this point, but we may see Hellions rise up in the meta once players have time to adjust to the changes. But more than likely, the buffs will just increase the value of early game Hellions before transitioning out of them into other comps. We'll have to wait and see, though, how the meta changes. Rangers are in a weird position because they can do well with Aphelios as the carry. Ashe can be used as a carry if you 3-star her early, and Varus is used and redeemed as a pseudo carry. The issue is that Rangers are difficult to get up and running consistently, since you need to be level 8 and need Aphelios 2 to properly run a 4-Ranger build. Getting to that point is not easy considering Rangers are relatively weak early on unless you're running Varus with redeemed. Overall, Rangers have the potential in the meta, but lack consistency. Abomination is the synergy that could easily be near the top of A tier, but due to a lack of consistency, we've had to settle for it being only in the B tier. This is because 5 Abominations is amazing when you have good items for the monstrosity and a solid backline. The problem is getting to that position since it requires an emblem and you'd likely need to high roll. At its best, Abomination is a contender in the meta, but on average it's going to be weaker than most other mid to late game compositions. Legionnaire has been regulated to the sidelines as no specific build really relies on it anymore. Instead, it's a trait you pair with other traits to bolster specific champions, such as Draven in Forgotten or Yasuo in Nightbringer Dragonslayer. It's certainly a useful synergy, but it's not the star of any build in the current meta. In the current meta, we see Assassin mostly used in the mid game with Katarina or occasionally Nocturne carry. Kha'Zix is also used often in the early game, though not because of the Assassin trait. With Coven being out of the meta and Katarina Viego being used primarily in Forgotten, there's really just no reason to play a full Assassin composition currently. That said, Nocturne can earn you a top 4, but it will struggle to do so. Draconic continues to be incredibly inconsistent. Sure, it can be strong if you hit it early and you get lucky on the eggs. In fact, we've seen Zyra 3 hit early into Stage 4, allowing that player to coast into the top 2. But how often does that really happen? Not a lot. Because of how inconsistent it is, we can't place Draconic higher on the list, even though it can be incredibly useful. And lastly, we have Knights. Knights aren't doing poorly, but compared to the other frontline options, they just don't quite cut it into the mid and late game. Kayle is playable late game, but nowhere near as common in the meta as she was previously, which lowers the value of Knights. Leona, Thresh, and Garen all have essential roles in the meta, but not because they're Knights. It's due to their other synergies as well as their abilities. So beyond the early game, we rarely see the Knight trait do a whole lot outside of niche situations with Kayle. Alright, let's move on to the last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Renewer, Spellweaver, Coven, God King, and Verdant. Bottom of the tier list is for 3 traits that can be useful but are far too niche to be higher on the list. The other 2 traits don't really do much. Up first is Renewer. Renewer has uses in the meta, most notably with Vladimir carry utilizing 2 Archangel's items. But it's not a consistent composition as it requires specific conditions to be met. Renewer also has a place later on in the game with Ivern, Soraka, and Heimerdinger, but unless you're committing to 4 Renewer, the trait doesn't really provide enough. 2 Renewers is only 3% health or mana, which isn't a whole lot and won't make much of a difference. Overall, the Synergy is playable early game, has a niche build, and potential late game, but there's too many scenarios where it just isn't doing enough. Spellweaver being this low on the list may come across as an odd choice since Vel'Koz is the top meta carry, and there's some compositions utilizing Brand and Zyra with Abomination. But keep in mind in those builds, Spellweaver is rarely ever that useful when you're only using 2. Sure, extra damage is nice to have, but Vel'Koz gets plenty of damage from items and redeemed. Zyra and Brand having more AP isn't all that relevant since Abomination builds rely more heavily on the monstrosity to carry. All in all, there's no necessity in the current meta to use Spellweaver, though having it is useful if you can squeeze it into redeemed composition with Vel'Koz. Coven. Coven has taken a nosedive in the meta with Katarina primarily being used in Forgotten and LeBlanc no longer being a viable carry. This has left the trait in a rather weak position since the only times it's relevant are for niche builds like Vladimir carry or Soraka carry. As we mentioned, those compositions aren't consistent. We may see Coven return to the meta if Forgotten is nerfed so that Katarina is an option again, but until there's another consistent champion to boost with Coven, it's unlikely that this trait will be all that relevant anytime soon. And the last 2 traits are, once again, God King and Verdant. It's so interesting to see how much value Garen has in the meta, and to a lesser extent Darius, but the main trait essentially does nothing. 20% damage boost against specific traits? That's it? And a lot of the time it's not even active in the current meta. God King is certainly a letdown, but at least Garen and Darius are relevant in the meta. As for Verdant, well, we've talked ad nauseum about how weak the trait is. The champions have a place in the meta, so occasionally we do have Verdant active, but rarely do you ever have 3 Verdants. And a mere 5 seconds of immunity is nothing to write home about. Hopefully we see some buffs to this trait soon, otherwise it seems like an obvious choice to get rid of when the mid-set happens. That's all we have for you for today's video. Overall, the meta leans heavily in favor of vertical synergies. That said, there's plenty of other options available to players outside of those traits. Let us know in the comment section below what you think of the current meta and what changes you'd like to see in the next patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to future Giant Slayer TFT videos.